I went on a fossil collection trip to Utah a month ago with a group of students and professors. Or that's what everyone else thinks. We didn't just go to collect fossils. We went to collect live specimens. If I had known that would happen, I wouldn't have gone in the first place. I should have said no. I should have taken a thesis opportunity in Wyoming, North Dakota, or Australia. But instead, I traveled back to the Cretaceous and haven't been the same since. It started when my professor, Dr. Jameson, reached out to me. It was an email about a thesis opportunity. She remembered a recent conversation we had about the evolution of angiosperms and decline of gymnosperms in the late Cretaceous. I agreed to continue the conversation in person only because she insisted on it, said that email wasn't safe. When I met her, I didn't believe her. I sat there as she told me what a group of physicists were able to do down in Utah, and that we had gained permission to do it as well. The longer I sat there, the more serious she got. She had a few sheets of paper from an NDA she had signed. She said it was proof. And just because I wanted to get my PhD, I went along with it. A month later, we flew from Portland to Salt Lake, and then to the Cretaceous. The day we left, we started at 4 a.m. On the drive to the university, I had déjà vu. My head was resting up against the window, and my whole skull vibrated, like it did whenever I rode the bus as a kid. Dr. Jameson sat beside me, her back as straight and unmoving as usual. We finally pulled into a near-empty parking lot illuminated by sporadic flickering sodium lights. I looked over to Dr. Jameson, who didn't return the courtesy. I peered out the window again. A group of cars were parked in the cone of orange light before us. Dr. Jameson unbuckled her seatbelt and let it slither back up into the holster. I followed suit and caught up to her as she marched up the sidewalk to the side of a large brick building. A glass door stood propped open. We both soon found ourselves in a small lecture hall lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. I stopped at the door as she continued further. It seemed that Dr. Jameson and I weren't the only pair of professors and students. I recognized the logos of some of the hoodies other students were wearing. A university in Utah, one in Texas, another in Santa Cruz. Everyone else was dressed in nondescript clothing, a group of 9 people total, including us. Everyone's eyes naturally turned to us, the same way a full class would when you walk through the door of a lecture hall. My face grew hot. I was never good at meeting new people. Dr. Jameson didn't waste time, marching over to some other professors and introducing herself. I stood in the doorframe, flexing my hands by my sides. Before I could do anything, one of the people dressed in non-university clothing stepped up to me and held out his hand. I frantically wiped my hand on my side before shaking his. It was an obnoxiously firm handshake. "I'm Ben. What's your name?" I swallowed as he kept pumping my hand. "Graham. Where are you from?" His eyebrows scrunched. "Washington, I suppose. I grew up there." "Oh." I let out a breath and wrested my hand from his grasp. "I mean, what university?" I motioned to the other people watching us from behind him. He laughed, a bit too loud for the time of day. A few people cringed. "I'm not a PhD candidate. I'm a journalist, although I graduated from..." "Are you familiar?" I nodded. "It's in Washington. If all goes right, you could find yourself as one of the people making history. You must let me interview you sometime before we embark. From what I understand, today could be quite busy." "You don't say." My eyes strayed to the other candidates. A few of them made eye contact with me. I got the feeling that I was being sized up. "For sure." Ben turned around and stepped aside. "Let me introduce you to everyone." A solid hand landed on his shoulder. He jumped slightly and looked back at Dr. Jameson. "No, let me," she said coolly. His smile was weak in return. Without another word, she steered me towards the professors and away from everyone else. I didn't think it was possible, but my hands got even clammier. "Graham, this is Dr. Chilton, Myers, and Potter." She motioned to the 3 people before us. They each shook my hand in turn. "Doctors, this is my mentee, Graham. He's especially interested in the evolutionary lineage of vascular plants and one of my brightest students. Ask him anything about evolutionary taxonomy and you won't be able to shut him up. They each nodded and said different variances of, "Oh, that's very nice." I immediately got the feeling of inferiority, much like a child that brought up a scribbled drawing to a distant relative. "Oh, how nice. Very good." I was shackled to the conversation for a few more minutes before I found a comfortable outing, much to my satisfaction. I hastily walked with my hands plastered to my sides back to Ben. I think I can say now that I preferred his company over a bunch of middle-aged doctors of geology, astrophysics, and paleontology. Ben was talking to the other 3 students. No, candidates there. I stopped by his side and fussed over the front of my shirt. Compared to the 3 before me, I must have missed the memo. I was the only candidate without a school hoodie or sweater. "Graham, we were just talking about you." Ben put his arm behind me and pushed me forward a bit. My stomach decided to play musical chairs with my heart. "Really?" "Yeah, we're trying to find out what school you're from," one of the other candidates said. For anonymity, I'll just call them by their university states/cities. Utah was a blonde woman with loose curls. Texas, a tall dark man with a terrifying grip. And Cruz didn't blink once, like at all. "I'm from Oregon. Go Ducks." I pumped a pathetic fist in the air while everyone stared at me. I was suddenly filled with the urge to fling myself off the nearest building. Talked for a while, and I gleaned that Cruz was another paleontology candidate, while Utah and Texas were astrophysics and geology, respectively. It was another few minutes before the 2 circles became a massive huddle. Dr. Chilton took the lead. "Sit, please," he ordered. We all sat except for Utah, who walked up to the stand beside Dr. Chilton. Once I sat in one of the cushioned chairs, I started to bounce my legs. Dr. Jameson sat beside me and eyed my bouncing legs with a disapproving look. I stopped and put my hands underneath my thighs. Utah gathered some folders and handed them out to the rest of us. When I received mine, I took a peek inside. There was my name. My name. "Now, I'm sure that all of you know why you're here." Dr. Chilton leaned back onto the podium behind him. "At this university, we have had a breakthrough. Our physics and engineering departments have collaborated on making a machine. You will see it shortly. With this machine, we will have the ability to go back in time. They have graciously allowed us to use it to collect samples and data from 66 million years ago. This will put us in the late Cretaceous. But you already know that." His eyes wandered to me. "You each are here for a reason, whether it be collecting botanical material or monitoring the stars and progression of the asteroid. Some of you will be paying attention to animal life or collecting rock samples. No matter our responsibilities, we have one rule. The only stipulation is that we must wear suits to prevent microbial contamination to the past. You cannot take these suits off if you are outside the shuttle. Understand?" Everyone nodded. After a long lecture about how the machine worked, why would we need to know that? He finally closed the talking with, "In each of your folders, you have objectives written by your mentors. That is your goal on this trip. Read as we walk to the next building." In the folder, I read my objectives from Dr. Jameson. The whole thing took up less than half a page. "Graham, it is likely that we will not recognize most of the plant species there. We should recognize some families at least. Since you have shown such an interest in vascular plants, I would like you to collect, if possible, 1 pteridophyte, 1 gymnosperm sample, and 1 angiosperm sample. We're traveling to the late Cretaceous, so there should be some angiosperms visible. If not, just get the closest thing you can. In this situation, anything is gold. Just understand, whatever you pick up is whatever you're going to study for the rest of your career. Choose wisely." I swallowed and braced myself as we walked back outside. It was well into the morning now. Our breath reminded me of a locomotive train, the way it billowed up and hung in the air like a noose over each of us. I shivered from the cold and reread my objectives. I resigned myself to 3 different things: 1 fern, 1 conifer, and whatever flowering plant I could find. I read through the sheet a few more times until we finally entered a new building. After a few moments, Dr. Chilton separated each of us by gender and someone led us to separate rooms. A group of people were there waiting for us. I felt like a convict as we were each handed plain clothing that looked like winter thermals and told to get changed. I kept my eyes on the wall and did as was ordered. A man in scrubs came up and neatly folded my clothes before he set them on a bench. Then we went through what I can only imagine doctors probably experienced. People in scrubs swarmed each of us and dressed us carefully. The suits that they put on reminded me of an astronaut, but less bulky and dark green. I felt heavier as they put a small backpack on my back with a silver canister. It was unnerving when I put on the helmet. Everything sounded muted. I looked over at Ben as his helmet got shoved on. The image was immediately blocked out by the bloom of condensation from my breath. One of the nurses, I'll just call them nurses, fumbled with something around my neck, and a bright puff of air shot past my ear and cleared my vision. Another nurse prodded the other side of my neck, and a tiny hiss told me that air was leaving through the side of my face. I looked back at Ben and waved. He waved back. Latches were pulled, and things were tightened for a few minutes, which gave me time to look around inside my helmet. There were tiny screens that blinked to life on either side of my head. Through them, I saw nurses working behind me, like I had my own backup camera. As they fiddled some more, Ben's voice crackled near my ear.
Not too shabby, huh?
I turned back to him.
I think I'm getting claustrophobic.
I joked. One of the nurses stopped and looked at me. I shook my head and waved him to continue. I could see behind me, talk to everyone else that had a suit on, and monitor the oxygen level in my suit.
What if we need to pee?
I asked one of the nurses. There were a few laughs through the comms, and I realized that I asked everyone that question.
There will be a bathroom on the shuttle, as well as a way to decontaminate before you go back inside.
Dr. Chilton said.
We should expect to be there for about an hour, so hopefully you won't waste that time. Use the bathroom for emergencies only.
We left the room and shuffled into a sterile-looking hall. Ben asked the question that made us stop. We should have stopped the whole operation there.
What if we encounter a velociraptor or a T-Rex? What if something tries to eat us?
There was no reply for a moment, before Dr. Potter answered the question.
It's unlikely that we will encounter a velociraptor, as those lived in Asia. We're going to be where Utah is today, but, well, in the Cretaceous, it will be a swamp. The only thing we need to worry about is not puncturing our suits.
We all began walking.
Then what will Cruz be able to observe?
Ben asked.
Isn't he supposed to look at animal life, or what Dr. Chilton said?
Cruz huffed.
That's if I can see anything.
He muttered.
There are more than just dinosaurs, you know. Ancient invertebrates. Fish. Maybe.
He drifted off.
Oof,
was Ben's reply. Coming from the journalist, I was sure that stung.
What are you supposed to do?
Cruz asked. Ben raised his hands up and mimed holding a camera.
I'm here to document everything, get pictures of you guys, take in the details. My usual job.
That sounded a lot less stressful than the rest of us. We walked in silence until we came to a large, silver door with a rotating wheel in the center. It seemed out of place, like it should be in a submarine. Two of the doctors, Myers and Chilton I think, rotated the handle and pulled the door open. We walked in single file to a small hallway that opened into another room.
Take your seats,
one of the doctors instructed. I looked around and saw seats positioned evenly through one side of the room, with two located at the far end. Texas turned, his suit creaking.
Is this the shuttle?
He asked. There were no windows, just metal walls. There was a hiss of air as the door sealed itself on the other side of the small hallway. No, not a hallway, an antechamber.
Yes,
Dr. Jameson replied as they hauled shut another door with an identical spinning wheel. I began to hear my heartbeat in my ears. On a far wall, there were what looked like multiple dressers, all away from the seats and divided by a low metal barrier. I eased myself down into a seat and waited for Dr. Jameson to sit beside me. She didn't. She sat at the front, near the wall, where a panel stuck out. When she looked over her shoulder at me, she nodded to the dressers.
The one on the far left? That has the equipment you'll need to collect samples.
I nodded. The other doctors relate similar information. The seat I had chosen was farthest away from the dressers, up against the wall. I relaxed into the armrests and felt the cold of the metal. I could imagine that I was an astronaut ready for liftoff. At the time, I only hoped that this wouldn't be like the Challenger explosion. Cruz sat to my right, and Texas further down. Ben sat directly in front of me, and Utah next to him. They were engaged in conversation over the comms, something about seat belts. I looked over my shoulder and saw belts like a car seat. We had to be strapped in for the trip. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe something more spacey, or even the buckles found on airplanes? I wasn't even sure that I expected there to be seat belts at all. I followed suit, sure that each of the metal bits connected properly into a buckle at the center of my chest. Dr. Myers walked around and checked each of our restraints. He tucked and tightened the straps until each of us could barely move. When he got to me, he pulled so tight on a strap that it felt difficult to breathe. I told him so, but he didn't acknowledge me. Over the comms, I could hear someone breathing heavily. My legs started to bounce. It seemed like it took forever. But Dr. Myers finally sat down in his chair and buckled himself in. Once settled in, Dr. Chilton's voice came over. It was cold.
Here is what's gonna happen. I'm going to flip a few switches, press a few buttons. Nothing for you to worry about. You may feel queasy afterwards. If you need to vomit afterwards, be sure to do it in the bathroom.
He pointed at a curtain-off area in the corner.
During the trip, you'll feel yourself being tucked in multiple ways, almost like you're rolling around in a box. Don't worry about that. It is perfectly normal. Be sure to grit your teeth and don't loosen your jaw. We'd all like to keep our tongues.
We all nervously chuckled.
Keep your arms close to your chest.
I hugged my torso.
Lastly,
Dr. Chilton's voice became flat.
We're going to turn off the comms. Traveling messes with them, and it's much better to have them off. It'll be disconcerting, but know that we're all right here. By show of hands, is everyone ready?
We all raised our hands. Some of them were shaking.
Good. Intercoms off in 3, 2, 1.
The tiny speaker inside the helmet went silent. All I could hear was my breaths, the gentle hiss of air flowing through my helmet, and my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I wondered if I was in over my head. I'd like to think we all watched as Dr. Chilton flipped a few switches, but I can only speak for myself. He paused for a moment, fumbling with a key, pushed it into a button and turned it. When he pressed down, we left. I know what Dr. Chilton said, but I still wasn't prepared for the violence of the movements the room made. Immediately, we were pressed back into our seats like we were in a jet. A loud, pervasive hum started to fill the room. I gripped my sides and squeezed tight as I got squished more and more into the back of my chair. And suddenly, we jerked to the left. Through the helmet, I could hear a few cry out. The hum became louder, so loud it reverberated up through the chair and made my head rattle. We jerked a second time, and this time I saw Cruz's arm fly into my field of vision. I closed my eyes and started to count. It was a bad idea to close my eyes. I was overcome with an intense sense of vertigo. I opened them just as we spun into a barrel roll, like we were a drill tunneling through some dense strata. We jerked forward and rolled some more, then stopped abruptly. My head flung forward and crashed back into my headrest, cushioned, thankfully. I looked around, expecting it to be over. None of the doctors moved. That was when I heard the cracking. It came from the wall to my left. I stopped breathing for a second. Yeah, a cracking sound. It sounded like glass on the verge of breaking under some tremendous weight. Then, I heard someone moaning on the other side. "Please, please stay," were the words I heard, as if they were spoken from the other side of the glass sliding door. The voice was begging. No, pleading with someone or something to stay. I peered at the wall, trying to ascertain the exact spot where it came from. Before I could, the vibrating took over again, and we slid. I'm not sure how to explain it. Have you ever been driving when there's ice on the road? It had the same feeling of movement as sliding over a patch of long extended ice. The sounds stopped as soon as we slid. The feeling continued for a few seconds. Then we jerked to a stop. We sat for a moment before relaxing. I turned to Cruz.
Did you hear?
I forked my thumb over at the wall. Cruz looked at me in confusion.
Huh?
His voice was distant without the comms. The comms crackled, and Dr. Chilton's voice came over. I forgot about the sounds I heard.
We're lucky. That was a smooth ride.
I exchanged glances with Cruz.
Can we unbuckle now?
Texas asked.
It's hard to breathe. Sure.
Dr. Chilton threw up his hands.
Up, everyone.
We each unbuckled ourselves and shakily walked out of our seats. Utah especially looked a little green.
How do we know it worked?
Ben asked. Dr. Chilton smiled through his visor.
That's the fun part.
He said.
You should grab your camera. Second from the left.
He motioned across the room. Ben scrambled over and tugged at one of the drawers. He pulled out a professional-looking camera and a big lens. He tried to put them together multiple times, but his shaking hands kept messing up the alignment.
Wait.
He held up his hands as Dr. Chilton walked over to the antechamber. Ben hurried over to me and put the camera in my hands. I held still, too afraid to move and possibly break the equipment. After a few more tries, his lens docked into the correct socket. He took it and started to press a few buttons.
Okay, I'm ready.
Dr. Chilton turned back to the antechamber and walked over to the door.
Vivienne, can you help me?
Dr. Jameson hurried over and slowly pulled the door open to reveal the antechamber. I stayed behind as everyone, save Ben, surged forward to the bottleneck. Through the helmets and heads, I could see two people grasping at the wheel.
Say cheese.
Ben pointed the camera at me. I didn't say cheese. I was too focused on the door. After a few repeated pulls, it started to turn. The intercom filled with a burst of excited chatter, and with a great echoing thud, the door unlatched and swung outward. They all spilled out onto wet, spongy earth. I saw some splashes of water as a couple stumbled. Coming through the door was a bright ray of sunshine that extended through the antechamber. I covered my eyes for a moment before they adjusted and followed everyone out into the late Cretaceous. It was wonderful. I couldn't look at anything for long before another caught my eye. Every surface that wasn't water was cluttered with plants, ferns, cycads, what looked like a pine tree. I stumbled out after everyone and stopped. I needed to grab my collection equipment. I turned around and weaved past Ben to my drawers. When I pulled them open, there were 3 canisters the size of my forearm, as well as a spade and some pruners, like what you would use to prune rose bushes. I picked up one of the canisters and the hand spade and jogged back outside. The intercom was filled with bubbling, overlapping chatter. I couldn't make out any specific conversation happening. I tuned it out and scoured the surface with my eyes. The only thing going through my mind was, what could I study for the rest of my career? My eyes landed on a small tufted fern a few yards away, about the thickness of my wrist. I hurried over and dropped to my knees. In the rearview camera, I could see the others kick into gear and hurry back to their collection tools. The spade sank into the earth like it was butter. I almost moaned, not gonna lie. I couldn't hear it completely, but I could feel the roots of the small fern crunch and pop under the stress of me pulling it out of the ground. I gingerly tugged multiple times until a fist-sized clump of roots pulled out of the earth beneath the fern. I carefully opened the canister and slid the fern down to the bottom of it. It looked sad inside the canister without a lot of soil. I tipped the canister over and dumped the fern out before scooping some soil into the bottom. Then I put the fern back inside, where it rested evenly on the dirt. I hurried over the nearest puddle and scooped some water in as well. The fern would most likely die once I brought it back, leaving me with only the dead material to study. But what if it survived? I could only hope. I hurried back into the shuttle and bumped shoulders with Cruz, who carried short, fat canisters and a couple of nets. He didn't respond to my hasty apology. I gently laid the canisters down in its previous place and grabbed the second one. After tucking it under my arm, I double-fisted the spade and pruners. What would I grab next? The comms channel was silent, broken only by the occasional joyful exclamation or a gasp of excitement. I lurched out of the exit with the grace of an ex-murderer, eyes automatically on the swamp canopy to assess the trees. One caught my eye. It had large white flowers. Flowers meant pollen, and pollen meant more material to study. I ran over to collect the branches. They made a satisfying chic sound as I harvested them and stuffed them into the canister along with a bunch of flowers. It was on my third trip that things went wrong. I left the shuttle with the intent to dig up a small gymnosperm, maybe a prehistoric pine. I spotted a small sapling about 15 yards to the right on the bank of a stretch of water. I jogged over and fell to my knees once again before extracting the tiny tree, only a foot tall at most. I reached down into the soil with the spade and cut through the deepest root. After scooping a few bits of muddy soil up, I dropped the plant into the canister. Some of the water to my right rippled. I looked over and saw something in the water. It was a tiny splash.
Hey, Cruz?
I asked over the comms.
Yeah?
He panted.
There might be some fish over where I am, about 15 yards to the right of the pot. Where are you located? I'm grabbing my last canister. I'll see you in a few moments.
His huffing dominated my speaker for a moment. I stood up and held up my canister with my tiny plant and turned around to wave for Cruz. That was my mistake. His head bobbed over the ferns and shrubs like a disembodied apparition. I waved my hand high so he could more easily locate me. As I did that, I noticed the water ripple in my rearview cam. It's stupid, really, that we thought being in a swamp was a smart idea. What I saw in that grainy footage will haunt me to this day, even though I never saw it with my own eyes. Over 20 feet of a rough, scaly spine rose up to the surface of the water, as silent as a library whisper. The ripple was made by the tail, and I took a moment to process the whole length from snout to tail. My body reacted before my mind could. It was like an electric shock that launched me forward, just as the water erupted and a 40-foot-long alligator sprung from the water. I couldn't even scream as the giant mouth, as big as I was, snapped shut right where I had been a moment before. Two yellow eyes perched on the top of the head blinked in succession before readjusting. I tore in a great breath and screamed at the top of my lungs before sprinting away. All breathing on the comms stopped. I held tight to the canister and threw the spade behind me without looking. One look in the rearview camera, and all I saw was a maw and two huge, thick forelegs pinwheeling through the muck to get to me. The ground sympathetically vibrated with the creature's bulk as it pursued me. I think Dr. Jameson discussed it once in a lecture, how teeth marks had been found on dinosaur bones, and that hissing monster was hot on my tail. A crocodilian large enough that it ate dinosaurs, 6 to 7 tons. I had a horrifying vision. The crocodile would leap forward with a tremendous hiss, and the jaws would snap close on a foot. Then, like all crocodilians, it would drag me back to the water and spin around until my bone snapped. Or even worse, swallow me whole. I remembered the name Dr. Jameson called it and the mnemonic device that helped me remember. Dino-sook-us. Dino-sook-us. I sprinted into the brush, hoping that the increased cover would slow down the animal. I nearly ran into Cruz, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of delight and fear.
Run, stupid!
I slapped him on the back, and he sprinted after me. Branches snapped as the Dino-sook-us barreled through the brush to us. Shrubbery and young trees were parted like the Red Sea, pushed aside as if by a mudslide. I screamed the name over the comms.
Dino-sook-us! Dino-sook-us in the water!
The radio filled with chatter.
Dino-sook-us? What's a Dino-sook-us? Is that the noise? Why is the ground trembling?
Cruz ran to the left of the shuttle, and I instinctively ran to the right. I focused on the rearview camera and felt relieved when I saw that the Dino-sook-us paused before pursuing Cruz. I felt a stab of guilt, but I was alive. I kept running and adjusted my course to get to everyone else. I dropped the canister onto the spongy earth when Dr. Jameson ran towards me. The rumbling in the ground faded and then stilled. In the distance, There was still the sound of branches snapping.
Are you okay? What happened?
I put my hands on my knees and sucked in great, heaving breaths.
Dinosuchus ambushed me at the water's edge.
I gasped for the air that kept pumping into my helmet.
Followed Cruz, led away from shuttle. What's a Dinosuchus?
Utah asked.
A really big crocodile. Like, really big. Big enough to eat a T-Rex. Get away from the water.
Dr. Jameson responded. Utah peeled behind the glass of her helmet and shuffled away from the small pond near her. Cruz's gasping for breath echoed over the comms. Dr. Jameson was helping me up when we both heard him gasp a name.
Dr. Potter, look out!
He wheezed.
Look out! Run!
We all froze as a weak scream echoed over the intercom. And then the Dinosuchus stopped running. The swamp went silent. I fumbled for the canister.
We should get back to the shuttle.
Everyone nearby didn't hesitate and swiftly moved back to the shuttle entrance. Cruz's breathing clouded the comms channel, but we all heard the groans of Dr. Potter. I still can't get them out of my head. Sometimes I find my mind wandering to what it must have been like, how she probably scrabbled backward in the muck to get away.
No, 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 no!
Her petulant voice snagged on each breath she took.
Cruz, somebody?
The comms filled with a terrible hiss, which echoed less than 50 yards away. Dr. Potter began to scream.
No, somebody please help me.
We each made our way to the entrance of the shuttle and filed through, tripping over each other with as much eagerness as we had when we stepped outside. Dr. Potter's screams continued.
My leg! It's got my leg! Dr. Chilton!
A loud crack like a gunshot whipped through the air, along with a piercing scream that hovered on the border between human and inhuman. The ground began to tremble again, and our comms were filled with a huge splash, and the flurry of water bubbles on the glass of Dr. Potter's helmet. The screams continued, all attempts at words gone for a few moments. We were all in the antechamber of the shuttle, frozen in place. I gripped my canister tighter and closed my eyes. A terrific rumbling filled our ears. The screams were fainter now, but we stared at each other in horror as they became jerky, like a kid cooing as it bounced on its parent's knee. Cruz appeared in the door of the shuttle, prompting half of us to scramble away and the other half to scream. He ignored us and shambled past to collapse in his chair. Mud caked his boots and spattered the back of his legs. His breaths drowned out the near-mute groans of Dr. Potter. I set my canister down in a stupor and fished for the handle to the door. Dr. Jameson put a hand on my arm.
Is everyone else in the shuttle?
Her voice was flat. A chorus of replies came back affirming it. We both reached out to the wheel and heaved the door shut, cutting out the harsh sunlight and leaving us in the fluorescent glow. It took more effort than I was willing to admit, turning the wheel and locking the door.
Everyone?
Dr. Chilton said.
We need to leave.
Cruz nodded, his body limp like an accordion in his chair. I scuffed over to my seat and collapsed into it. The others followed suit. I was fumbling with the buckle along with everyone else when a voice came over the comms again.
No, please.
Dr. Potter said. It was fuzzy, but it was her.
Please, don't leave.
We all froze and looked at each other in stunned silence.
Potter, can you hear me?
Chilton said.
Yes.
A weak reply, but the signal was stronger, clearer. Utah put a hand over her heart and held back a sob.
Can you make it to the door? Has the Dinosuchus left you alone?
A bit of silence.
No, it got me. Please don't leave.
Her voice jerked, and she let out a low moan.
I don't want to die alone.
A watery scraping sound echoed over the comms, like hands on a freshly washed window. The ground began to vibrate again. Her breaths became louder and clearer, as did the vibration.
Oh my god.
Ben raised his hands to the sides of his helmet.
I think she's inside it right now.
A crystal clear broken sob fluttered through the speakers. I felt suddenly nauseous and hugged my stomach. We listened in horror as a familiar noise played over the comm. The same cracking I heard on the trip here. Her helmet was giving way under the pressure of peristalsis.
Please don't leave me.
Her voice turned to weak sobs, and more cracking. Her breath hitched for a moment, and the cracking became accented by another new groan.
Please stay.
The sounds became more intense for a moment, followed by the tight wheezing of Dr. Potter's chest compressing as some terrifying pressure contracted over her body. Then, with a sick grunt, her last word. The cracking stopped suddenly and was replaced with a low, paralyzing crunch. To my left, just on the other side of the wall, the ground rumbled. Both Texas and Ben twisted their helmets off and leaned to the side to vomit. I looked away as the retching filled my helmet. After a few moments, like a zombie, I began to fasten the buckles over my chest. After I was done, I stared down at the small conifer in my hand. I looked up again when Dr. Chilton asked all of us if we were ready to leave. We all raised our hands. The comms cut off without another word. The trip back to the future was rough. The whole time, I kept the plant close to my chest, and when I heard cracking on the other side of the wall, I blocked it out. We arrived back with another long slide. Perhaps us sliding into the right time. After we stopped moving, we all sat in silence. When the comms flicked back on, multiple people were sniffing. I took a big, deep breath and let it out. My diaphragm collapsed as I burst into tears with everyone else. I should have said no. I should have taken a thesis opportunity in Wyoming, North Dakota, or Australia. But instead, I traveled back to the Cretaceous and haven't been the same since.